Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining Fireweed Zinc's live investment summit today, hosted by SIX, Geology of a new Zinc-Lead-Silver discovery at Boundary West. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers today, Brandon McDonald, CEO and Director, and Dr. Jack Milton, Chief Geologist. The team's going to walk you through a company presentation, and after that, we will be accepting questions. As a reminder, you can submit your questions in the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of the screen at any point during the presentation. And as always, our webinar is being recorded and is going to be available for playback both on six.com and on the Fireweed Zinc website. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Brandon to kick things off.
Thanks very much, Jane. Thank you, everyone, for attending. For those wondering how big the assay beard is getting, as I said, I'm not shaving till the last of our assays are in. If nothing else, this has taught me that if the zinc business fails, I've got a future as a mall Santa. So obligatory forward-looking statements, warning. Look, I think most of you have seen this presentation before, so I want to kind of breeze through a lot of this and hand it over to Jack, as that's the presentation that I think you're here for. But look, some quick reminders. We've already seen sector rotation into base metals, copper, zinc, nickel, etc., all performing extremely well. This is based on fundamentals, immediate fundamentals, but this is also based on the expectation of global infrastructure spend. So when you're thinking zinc, you want to invest in a zinc project. Obviously, Macmillan Pass, a clear standout, size, economics, blue sky. It's a sort of project that already attracted the attention of tech and has got a lot of people very interested in it. So the 2020 program, it says potentially game-changing there. It was game-changing. I should probably update my slides. The discovery at Boundary West, for a whole host of reasons, beyond just the scale, immediate scale implications for Boundary Zone as a whole. Boundary West has some very interesting implications for the prospectivity of the whole project. And despite all this, this nascent bull market in base metals, fireweed's incredibly cheap. And I think I've made this analogy a lot before, and I've talked a lot about it, and I think it bears repeating. South 32 transacting for basically 2 billion Canadian in 2018. That was a 30x move in their share price in the last 2.5 years of the company's existence. So that's what happens when a truly world-class project gets recognition, gets traction with a major miner, and gets taken out. And we hope, massive forward-looking statement, and perhaps even expect that something like this will eventually happen with Fireweed Zinc because of the quality of Mac Pass. And we do this in a way that doesn't take shortcuts. I think people who know me and who follow me understand that we try to be clear in our communications, honest, forthright. We treat all our shareholders with respect, from the smallest to the biggest, and we try to focus on long-term value creation. We're not running cheap marketing tactics to drive the share price out to the benefit really only of a small amount of shareholders. I mean, management are significant shareholders of this company, and we're in it for the long term. Our chairman's put in $500,000 into Fireweed this year alone. So we're seeking a substantial exit for everyone, and including ourselves. And that, I think, skin in the game and focus on long-term value creation separates us from a lot of juniors. And that's in part because of the philosophy we've derived from the Discovery Group. For those who don't know the Discovery Group, I think the standout companies now, obviously, Great Bear, Kodiak Copper doing very well lately, Bluestone, looking great with their project, and everyone else, K2, Ethos, Genesis, Elemental, Valor, etc. This is a good group of companies. Will every company be a success? No, but every company has a legitimate project taking a legitimate shot at it. And it's that approach to things, that non-cynical approach, I think, that differentiates us. To reiterate, and I don't want to dwell on this. The share structure after an IPO in 2017 remains tight, not a huge amount of float, pretty tightly held, and we've got a pretty great board to back us up with a diverse amount of experience. And look, so I got to get into the project. I'm going to leave most of the project talk to Jack, but I want to kind of hit the high points. You know where it is, Eastern Yukon Territory, located on the Canal Road. As you can see from that photo there, we can drive a truck and trailer with a D6 on it into the site. That means immediate benefits in terms of reducing exploration costs, but long term, when it comes time to build it, it is much simpler to improve an existing road than to build a new road in Yukon, and I mean anywhere. The 2018 PEA, I think, was an important moment for the company. When we bought the project, the core of the project, I should say, off Hud Bay, there was a lot of concerns that it was remote and simply didn't work, right? And I think what the PEA established was not only does it work, it works extremely well as just the Tom and Jason deposits, but people shouldn't get too anchored to those. You think about how much we've done since then, and this is not just the expansion of the property. A lot of what I want to talk about today, before I hand it off to Jack to talk about Boundary, is that Tom and Jason are a lot better than they were in 2018. We understand a lot more about them, and that tiny corner of our property still, for the time being, is the center of gravity, and it's important to not neglect it. And the resource we put out there, 11.5 million or 11.2 million tons, 39.5 million tons inferred. Very, very big resource, and that's just between Tom and Jason. That's Tom East, Tom West, Southeast, Jason Main and South. Does not include Tom North. Does not include the step out drilling we've done in those areas. In particular, 2019 Tom North drilled that, to sort of define what was there. Good grades for open pit, extends the likely open pit life at the Tom West or broadly the Tom area, in conjunction with some improvement of grade in the higher grade parts of Tom West due to historical holes having poor recovery. We think alone, that this is a significantly different looking pit when we re-engineer it than it was in the 2018 PEA. And we still have some really interesting mysteries to crack at Tom. The step out hole that we drilled in 2018, very, very high grade, just off Tom East, 16.5 meters of 21% zinc, 13% lead, and 240 grams silver. This is for a polymetallic project, basically bonanza grade. But what's interesting is we now understand, thanks to some additional structural mapping this summer, that's not folded as you actually see in this diagram here. So this cross section you're seeing here is not consistent with our current thinking. We think now that's on the other side of the Tom fault, the major fault through alongside Tom West and Tom East. So we don't know what that TS18004 really intersected and how much more is there, and it has this intriguing possibility that there might be a significant amount of mineralization on the other side of the fault. And then at Jason, as we've said from the get-go, this is two sides of a syncline. They're going to be connected at depth. There's significant possibility for additional tonnage there. We know Jason South is faulted into several offset bits. The two different lenses, being faulted off at least twice. The furthest east faulted area of that does not have enough drill intersections in it to define a resource on it, but has good drill grades, 13.5 meters of 7% zinc, 5% lead, 120 grams silver. This is very healthy grade. So as we get a chance to drill that and define a resource on that, again, improves the resource at Tom and Jason. But what Jack's going to talk about today, and I don't want to dwell on this, is that Boundary, which we picked up in late 2018 after the PEA and after the resource, which we didn't drill until late 2019, looks very interesting. What was kind of a afterthought for us, the more thinking we do around it, And the more we try to piece together that puzzle, the more intriguing it is. This is a substantial mineralized system at Boundary Zone, both in terms of size, but also in terms of locally grade. So understanding the genesis and distribution of this massive zinc system at boundary and area is critical. And we think it's going to play a big part in the future of this project, and is really going to pull that center of gravity of the project west. So look, I want to wrap up here and hand it off to Jack. Key things being, 2018 PEA, 450 million after-tax NPV. Since then, we've done a lot of improvement and expansion of the resource at Tom and Jason. We've got some very excellent news from the government in terms of funding for our road. We've done some engineering work, which has helped us rethink some assumptions some very conservative assumptions from the 2018 PEA. And then there's the possibilities at Boundary Zone and the broader property. The next PEA, which we expect to deliver mid 2022, is going to look a lot different. And what we're targeting there is what should be hopefully a clear tier 1 project. That this is a top 10 production profile in zinc lead projects globally, first or second quartile costs, long, healthy mine life. And projects like that, by definition of being top 10, do not come along particularly often. So, we think there's going to be a tremendous amount of interest in the project from majors, more than there already is when we really define the opportunity there. Look, so whatever, I'm not going to summarize this. I'm going to hand it off to Jack. Go for it, Jack.
Thanks, Brendan. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to get on with talking about the geology of our new discovery at Boundary Zone West and how it ties into what we already knew at Boundary Zone Main. And I will be making some forward-looking statements during this presentation. So first, a little bit of background about the Selwyn Basin. And the Selwyn Basin is a prolific zinc basin. And it's split into 3 districts. It spans a huge portion of the Yukon, from Faro, where there was once the world's largest open pit zinc mine. And the Faro mineralization is hosted by Cambrian rocks. Also over at Howard's Pass, it's only 90 kilometers from where we are at Macmillan Pass. There's a very high tonnage zinc lead deposit, and that's hosted in early Silurian host rocks. Where we are at Mac Pass, all the zinc deposits found so far have been hosted by mid to late Devonian rocks, and this is similar to some of the deposits in northeast BC. But our new discovery at Boundary Zone West, we see mineralization occurring in both the Devonian, and we've discovered mineralization in this Howard's Pass style early Silurian position in the stratigraphy. So yeah, we're at Mac Pass, and Tom and Jason, between them, there's some of the largest undeveloped zinc deposits worldwide that are held by a junior company. And we've announced a couple of weeks ago a discovery at Boundary Zone West, and this should shed some light on some of the geology of what was quite a technical release. So before we get to Boundary, I was just going to take a moment to discuss some of the exploration targets that we talked about last year. So the 240-mile target, we did drill at the end of the program, but we did not reach the favorable stratigraphy before the weather chased us out. So that's still an unanswered question. We ran some gravity and some soils at Volcanic Zone, found a good gravity anomaly, and confirmed the historic lead and soil anomalies that are occurring. And this is the target that could be the source of a glacially dispersed boulder that's lead rich and is found near Boundary Zone. We did some prospecting at Zinc Moss target and at 11, and ran some soil lines confirming the very large and high-grade zinc anomaly. But what I'm going to focus on is Boundary Zone and the discovery at Boundary Zone West. So this is similar to the slide that Brandon showed here, but we've updated it. So these 2 holes with the colors, colored right here, the holes where we intersected very broad intervals of zinc mineralization from surface, and this included 230 meters. That's a true thickness of 4.14% zinc, and the first 100 meters from surface of that hole was nearly 8% zinc. And in hole 1, we intersected 230 meters of 3.4% zinc. So these are some really significant widths and grades of zinc occurring from surface in a bulk tonnage style system with very broad, large geometry that's would be perhaps amenable to open pit mining. The hole 2 that we drilled this year is shown here in the dark gray, black color. And we drilled this in the other orientation. So we turned the drill around and we drilled back into the deposit. And this, first of all, let us, we had a gain of ground in the mineralization extended further than the target depth. But importantly, we had some concerns at boundary zone that some of the veins were following the direction that we were drilling in the core, which could bias grades to be higher than they truly are. But drilling in this direction confirmed that the veins are randomly oriented in a stockwork fashion, and this means that the grades are broadly representative of the system as a whole, which was a really positive result from this year. Although we haven't received any of the assays from the holes this year, but we could certainly see that in the vein textures in the core. And this is what they look like. So this is the heart of boundary zone, and you see matrix infill clast replacement in volcaniclastic rocks. You see brittle veins, stockwork veining, vein breccias, and sometimes very thick banded veins in the mudstones. And these veins comprise sphalerite of different colors. We have an early red-brown sphalerite and a late tan sphalerite. And we also see siderite and pyrite, like in the image in the bottom right. And in thinking about this last winter, we're trying to find a geological analog for the exploration at boundary zone. And the closest we could come up with was Red Dog. And Red Dog is a very large zinc mine and series of deposits in Alaska. And these shots on the right are from the vein ore at Red Dog. And the vein ore is the cross-hatched symbol on the cross-section. And this underlies a barite cap, the bottom portion of which is replaced by silica, and in places in dark gray by massive sulfide. And we use this as an analog to say that perhaps what we've discovered so far at boundary zone is this vein ore that may underlie a barite cap where we may expect to find massive sulfides. And that's kind of summarized in this conceptual diagram that we put together last winter, conceptualizing the massive sulfide replacement of a barite layer that would sit in the stratigraphy just higher than boundary zone. And we know that the barite occurs at this layer in the stratigraphy. And we drilled a hole at boundary zone west, and we intersected massive sulfides consistent with the model that we were using to target this mineralization. So how do we do that? Well, we ran a large ground gravity survey, which is outlined by this purple box here, over the center of boundary zone. And in most of those historic drill holes you see on the map, there is at least some mineralization, some zinc mineralization, and we knew that the boundary zone was a very large hydrothermal system. But the ground gravity is showing us the density contrast in the subsurface. And we were targeting the siderite alteration, which is very dense, and the pyrite and sphalerite and perhaps galena mineralization, which is also very dense and will show up as gravity highs. And what we were surprised at is that the center of this gravity anomaly extends much further west than the core of boundary zone. And we followed this up immediately with offensive drill holes. And so we're going to zoom in on this closer, sort of more central part of this gravity anomaly. These contours you can see are the milligauss, half milligauss contours of the residual gravity anomaly. And we're going to look at two sections. A to A prime is the one that we just saw, and that includes the 2019 drilling. and the hole 2 that drilled back towards into the deposit, and section B to B prime, and this is boundary zone west, and this will show holes 4 and holes 7 and 9. 7 and 9 were drilled from the same collar, and hole 7 had to be re-drilled as hole 9. And the section B to B prime is boundary zone west, and it's the new discovery, and the mineralization that we're talking about is located between these two faults here, F1 and F2. And these are splays that come off of the Hess fault, and the Hess fault is a very large crustal scale fault that spans kilometers across the Yukon, and it can be traced almost all the way to Keno. So it trends for many kilometers, and it started life as a sedimentary rift fault, likely early in the Paleozoic or late Neoproterozoic. And since then, it's been reactivated multiple times, and the latest movement on that fault is likely Eocene, so about 40 million years ago. So before we dive into boundary zone west, I just want to talk about hole 3, which was our furthest west hole that we drilled into this gravity high. This intersected older rocks, some Cambrian and Ordovician rocks, and it also drilled in the direction of bedding. And before drilling hole 9, we kind of wrote this off and said, oh, the rocks are too old, it's likely unprospective. But knowing what we now know from the geology of hole 9, that we see how it's past style mineralization here in those older rocks, we've now upgraded this portion of the gravity anomaly in terms of what we think the potential is in terms of the prospectivity. And if we were to come back and drill this target, we'd anticipate drilling that towards the north and likely in a slightly different part of the gravity anomaly, knowing what we now know. But the gravity anomaly between these two faults is extensive. It's well over 500 meters in strike length. And we just drilled the first 2 holes into the highest portion of that gravity anomaly this year, and that's what we're going to focus on. So this is that section, B to B prime, and hole 4 and holes 9 and 7 here drilled, or hole 4 drilled through this fault, and then into the full lake member mudstone, and then hit 26 meters of massive sulfide mineralization. And this massive sulfide was mostly pyrite, with various amounts of sphalerite and small amounts of galena. But this sort of confirmed our thesis about there being a massive sulfide cap to the system. And we see clear evidence for the existence of barite that's subsequently been replaced by silica or pyrite, as you can see on the images on the right. And this is what the massive sulfide looks like. So there we go there, those 4 images showing the massive sulfide in core. And you can see this red-brown color mineral, that's sphalerite, that's where the zinc is located. And that occurs throughout this interval of massive sulfide. And this is very similar to some of the mineralization that is seen up at Red Dog in Alaska. And so if we go back to that conceptual model, then this confirms that this is no longer a conceptual target, as we were terming it here, but we've confirmed the presence of this massive sulfide layer, forming a cap to the system. And there's much barite in this interval in the stratigraphy, and we think that even though most of it is massive sulfide now, you can see these relic textures, these isolated patches of black mudstone, which likely indicate that the whole sequence was originally barite and has subsequently been completely replaced by sulfide. In addition, we see Tom-style stratiform mineralization, and this is this laminated style of sphalerite and galena mineralization. And here the sphalerite is this kind of straw-colored mineral, and the galena is a gray mineral. And we see this on the section at the position T, where we see T and a thin bar of green mineralization. We see this, which was a first for boundary zone in seeing extensive and relatively high grade Tom mineralization but over relatively narrow intervals. And this occurs adjacent to or within the massive sulfide intervals in holes 4 and hole 9 and 7. And this style of mineralization is then overprinted by a later and wider interval of vein mineralization. And on these sections, the bright red color is showing the vein-hosted sphalerite mineralization. And this occurs in a wide interval in what we're terming the upper sequence. So the upper sequence comprises this massive sulfide and a wide interval of vein-hosted sulfide. Moving down into the green layer of rock, which is the volcaniclastics, these are replaced extensively by pyrite, sphalerite, and galena. And this is consistent with what we've seen in the stratigraphy back at the heart of boundary zone, is that this layer is highly reactive and it picks up the replacement very well. So this upper sequence is within Devonian rocks. It's the urn group, and these are mid to late Devonian in age. And what this looks like in the Tom style mineralization is this laminated textures on the left, and on the right we see more barite that's been replaced in this case by silica and in a few cases by pyrite. Either these barite nodules in the upper picture or these laths of barite in the lower picture. And what we were not expecting, but were very pleased to see, was this large interval of Howard's Pass style mineralization at the bottom of hole 9. So on hole 9, where you see the burgundy color and the letter H, that is what we're terming Howard's Pass style mineralization. And this is stratiform sphalerite mineralization hosted by some older rocks that are late Ordovician to early Silurian in age. And we know this because we drilled through some graptolites, which are these small fossils that can be used to very accurately date the age of the rocks. So this is what this style of mineralization looks like. It's stratiform replacements of laminae and little layers in the rock. It's perhaps replacing radiolaria, tiny little microfossils. And it either occurs as this very fine-grained red-brown sphalerite or this medium to coarse-grained steel-gray sphalerite that's running along these layers. And these then get remobilized into these syntaxial quartz veins, where it's forming quartz, where you have quartz in the wall rock in the siliceous mudstone, and where it cuts the gray sphalerite, you're getting that remobilized as this yellow or straw-colored sphalerite in these veins. So let's taking a closer look at these ages. We see the upper sequence is the Tom style mineralization, and we know from the stratigraphy very well that this is constrained to the Franian, which is an upper Devonian unit. And the lower sequence is represented by this lower, thicker black bar. And this is the stratiform mineralization in the Howard's Pass style. Howard's Pass itself occurs in this red interval. So you can see that the mineralization that we intersected includes the Howard's Pass interval, but also spans a wider age range of host rocks and is potentially a thicker portion of mineralization. And this is really significant because this is the first discovery of stratiform mineralization in these age host rocks, in early Silurian host rocks in the Mac Pass district. Prior to this, all the mineralization that was known was in the late Devonian host rocks. So this was really significant to see not only Tom-style mineralization, but a barite cap to the system, and this all underlain by Howard's Pass style mineralization in the older rocks in the lower sequence. And all of these styles of mineralization are overprinted by multiple generations of sphalerite and pyrite veins. So what is the significance of Howard's Pass? And if we zoom out for a second and take a look at the Selwyn Basin, we can see that we're here at Macmillan Pass, and about 90 kilometers to the southeast is Howard's Pass, where in the purple box you see there is a large resource on that, 185 million tons of indicated at 5.2% zinc, about 1.8% lead, in addition to 238 million tons of inferred at similar or just lower grades. So really large tonnage deposit is present at Howard's Pass. And we see this age of mineralization further east at Prairie Creek in the Mackenzie platform, and we now see this at Mac Pass deeper into the southern basin. And on the left, you can see the detailed age constraints that we have at Howard's Pass, and these are from 3 different sources. We see the pyrite that's been dated at that age as the red line. We see graptolites coming out of the mineralized zone and the rocks surrounding it, which pins those as Rhodanian or Iranian, which is part of the early Silurian. And conodonts, which is a microfossil that can also be used to date rocks, is consistent with this age too. So very strong evidence that that is the age of the rocks that we have. And we were lucky enough to drill 2 graptolites in the first hole that we put into the new discovery at Boundary Zone West. And these perfectly bracket that age of the active mudstone member at Howard's Pass, which is where the mineralization is. And it's important to note that the zinc mineralization that we see, the stratiform zinc mineralization, extends above and below these age controls of graptolites. So what we see is a sort of minimum age range of upper Ordovician to early Silurian, and mineralization extending into both slightly younger and slightly older rocks. So on top of these styles of stratiform mineralization that we see in these holes, we also see overprinting vein mineralization, and these occur as multiple generations of pyrite and sphalerite veins. And typically the sphalerite in these later veins is this more pinkish color, or in the middle photograph you see this early red-brown sphalerite with a later tan sphalerite, and you can see that same sort of pattern in the lower photograph. And that's more typical of the mineralization that we saw back on section A to A prime at the heart of Boundary Zone. But in the top photo here, you can see that early stratiform gray sphalerite as the top labeled sphalerite being overprinted first by pyrite veins and secondly by another generation of sphalerite veins. And this is not just remobilizing this sphalerite very locally on the margins of these veins. This is bringing additional zinc into the system as another pulse of mineralization. We don't know when this occurred during the history of the host rocks. So what does this vein mineralization look like? These are 4 photos of the vein mineralization from the new discovery. There's various different colors of sphalerite that we see. We see this pink color of sphalerite, and again, these later quartz veins that seem to remobilize this into straw-colored sphalerite. We do see a little bit of galena with some of this mineralization, particularly in the lower part of the system. And some of these veins are sheared up, like these ones you can see, with that sort of characteristic early red-brown sphalerite and late tan sphalerite colors. So this is a schematic that I put together of the geology, and it's very cartoonish, but it illustrates the different parts of the lower and upper sequences and how they relate to the geology. But what we can see is that the mineralization is focused around a fault, which we see is that F1 fault that splays off the Hess fault. And the first pulse of mineralization to come up is likely the lower sequence stratiform mineralization shown in the purple color. And this would be during the late Ordovician to early Silurian. And this fault is likely still active during the Devonian, about 70 million years later, where we're seeing barite forming first in the subsurface diagenetically, and that's likely using that same fault structure to focus fluids that are forming that barite in the subsurface. And then the fault is active again, and fluids come up the fault and replace that massive sulfide, or replace the barite with massive sulfide, likely during some point during the late Devonian. And these are then overprinted by this vein style of mineralization. So this is highly schematic, and it shows the aspect ratio of this being taller than it is wide. But this is not necessarily true. We really don't know the lateral extent of this system. It could be quite continuous and laterally extensive. But we've basically put the first 2 drill holes into this system, and it's open in all directions. So this could be significantly more, significantly wider than it is high. But the key thing is that there's multiple pulses of mineralization here at boundary zone, and that it's a very long-lived hydrothermal system. And these different overprinting episodes of mineralization utilizing the same structure is going to result in a very large time-integrated fluid flux. And this points to this fault being connected to the Hess fault, which is a very deep crustal scale fault. And you have a very large plumbing system that is continually active through a long period of time. And this is a key ingredient in forming a very large deposit. And we think that this is the geological evidence that we're seeing that indicates that there's potential here for a substantial deposit at boundary zone. So I just wanted to reiterate that all of our assays from 2020 are still pending. We haven't received them back yet, but we shall be releasing them as soon as we receive them. The labs are very backed up right now. But the deposit at boundary zone and the new discovery is open in all directions. And we think that the size of the gravity anomaly that we're seeing is indicative of a very large hydrothermal system. And we think that the potential there is very large. A couple of weeks ago, we also announced that we expanded our property significantly to the west, and we now have 936 square kilometers of ground at Macmillan Pass. And this extends in the direction of the fertile corridor, which is centered around the Hess fault. We see this in our targeting criteria as one of the key components, is being connected to this crustal scale plumbing system and having access to large volumes of fluid to focus them into these target areas. And the discovery of Howard's Pass style mineralization at Mac Pass really blows the doors open in terms of the search space for zinc in the property. Previously, a lot of the exploration had focused almost exclusively on the Urn group and a specific part of that where you see mineralization at Tom adjacent. And there's a very large component of Road River group, or the early Silurian rocks, that host the Howard's Pass mineralization in the new property and on our existing tenement. So it really opens the search space for zinc. The new acquisition came with a large amount of airborne mag, EM, and a huge geochemical database that's never been looked at in terms of base metal exploration. It was used for Carlin gold style exploration. And it's an opportunity, a real opportunity here to take some high quality data and a new idea in an old district to do some very systematic and thorough exploration for additional deposits aside from Tom, Jason, End Zone, and Boundary Zone on the rest of the property. So just bringing up one of Brandon's slides again here to reiterate that the base case PEA in 2012, we've done significant work on that. There's a lot of potential in engineering the project, expanding the resources, the funding commitment from the government to reduce our cost of funding the road are all potential avenues to increase MPV. But I hope I've shown you the geological criteria that we think the boundary zone has to add a stepwise change to the project and move the center of mass of the project slightly to the west. In addition to these new ideas being able to be applied more broadly across the property, and that there's lots of blue sky potential for additional exploration targets. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and I believe now we can move to the Q&A.
All right, thank you very much, Jack, and thank you, Brandon. Looks like everyone's back for the Q&A session. We do have quite a few questions coming in, so let's hop right to it. Our first question is from Richard. Richard's asking, are there any plans to list in the USA to attract US investors?
Yeah, and Richard's second question there also relevant about liquidity. We have looked at a US listing. We did a lot of looking in 2018. One of the benefits of being in Discovery Group is that we get to look at other companies within the group as guinea pigs, see the ones that have listed in the US and see whether that's helped them a lot. My current understanding is that it's not so much the OTC listing that's helpful so much as the DTC eligibility. It is something we're definitely looking to do, but I don't want to make any promises about it being imminent. Our liquidity now, not bad. Certainly has improved a lot in the latter half of 2020 as the market conditions have broadly improved. But look, any way you can improve liquidity improves value, and this is something the absolute we have to pay attention to.
Great, thanks, Brandon. Next question is from Kevin. Is there any copper in the deposit?
Yeah, there is a very small amount of copper at Boundary Zone, but it's really just geochemically anomalous. It's not economically interesting. But the copper does generally show some of the deeper parts of the system, and it's something that we use in the targeting that points us back towards the feeder. And heading back towards the feeder is something where you may also expect higher zinc grades. And it's a targeting mechanism that we're going to use to follow up, particularly on the massive sulfide mineralization. What we drilled was mostly pyrite with some sphalerite, some galena, but more sphalerite-rich portions of massive sulfide may be expected closer to the feeder, and using copper as an exploration tool or vector is something that we use in our targeting.
All right, well, I'll go to the next question. So Constantine Mangold was asking about concentrate transportation costs. So in our 2018 PEA, we had calculated about $212 Canadian per wet metric ton to get concentrate from site to, I think, basically CIF Asia. So whether that's Korea or Japan or China, it's about the same to get there. That's a little bit cheaper than taking it to rail at Fort Nelson and then from Fort Nelson to Trail, tech smelter there. But it's close enough that it could be within the negotiating room on treatment charges. So it's expensive, but it's not punitive, and it certainly doesn't render the project uneconomic or anything like that.
Right, let's move on to the next question from Martin. Is there any cobalt or gold associated in the pyrite or barite zone at depth?
No, not really. There's very slightly elevated gold, but it's geochemically anomalous. It's certainly not what we consider economic grades. So it's not something that we are factoring into building a deposit at Boundary Zone.
Great. So Kevin's follow-up question is there enough barite to be an economic resource since it's used as a lot as a drilling mud?
Look, you could my last answer on the transportation cost should answer that, because is the barite valuable? Yes. There's nothing left in that value by the time you get it to the market, though. It's simply too expensive to transport from site to market. There's also the reality that we would be producing so much barite that you'd flood the Canadian market. So we make zero assumptions around or zero expectation of marketability around any barite we could make on site.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Next question is from Kento. Can you talk a little bit about the visual grade of the new mineralization zone?
No, we definitely cannot. So, sorry. I mean, no discussion of grade of these zones is possible until we have assays. Broadly speaking, it's a faux pas to talk visual grade because people usually get it wrong. And our past visual estimates have been not bad, but not like there's enough risk there, particularly Sphalerite being as nebulous as it is, that we would get it completely wrong. So yeah, look, for legal and technical reasons, we won't talk about that.
Got it, no problem. So then the next follow-up question would be, when do you expect to receive the 2020 essays?
Geez, so this is the $1 million question right now. I had hoped we'd have some by the end of November. Obviously, that's come and gone. Are based on what we're seeing from the lab so far, I'm at this point I'm not even sure we get our first hole by the end of the year. Look, maybe first hole within 2 weeks, maybe. And last hole is quite possibly February at this point, maybe worse. I've heard some real horror stories, unfortunately. So this may be a truly epic beard by the time we get the last of our assays.
Got it. So we'll keep our eye on that to see if there's any news coming. Next question is from Ian. Does the attack's negative road decision have any implications for the canal road funding by the government?
No. So look, one of the things I mentioned in my presentation was the benefit of having an existing road is that you have existing access. So I want to start by saying that I don't think the attack road is dead. I think they're going to be able to revisit that. But nonetheless, the challenges there are building a road into an unroaded area, right? So with us, it's a lot different. It's an existing road. Anyone can drive it. We can bring in heavy equipment. It's unfettered access up that road, right? So to us, it's a very, very different thing in terms of permitting, et cetera. And it's still full steam ahead in terms of improvements on the Robert Campbell and Canal Road from the government funding.
Great, thank you, Brandon. Next question is from Jacques. What are the types of rocks that contain zinc?
Yeah, so at Tom and Jason, the typical host is laminated barite, which is replaced to various degrees. When you're near the feeder, it's almost completely replaced. And when you're in the more distal zones, there's a lot more mudstone interbeds. At boundary zone, we see zinc hosted at the heart of boundary zone, primarily in volcanic clastic rocks. These are alkalic, mafic, volcaniclastic rocks that have been highly altered to calcite and dolomite in the matrix regionally. And at boundary zone, that gets replaced by siderite and sphalerite and galena and pyrite. There's also mudstones and conglomerates that host mineralization at boundary zone. And we see similar rocks that host mineralization at boundary zone west, in addition to the very silicious mudstones, black, organic, rich, sort of carbonaceous, silicious mudstones that host just sphalerite mineralization in the stratiform portion of the Howards Pass mineralization.
I'll answer James Gwanda's question about metallurgy. Presumably you're talking about difference in metallurgy between boundary and Tom and Jason. We don't know. This is something that we're sending material away for some answers this winter. Maybe having results back Q2 next year, late Q2, possibly early Q3. The expectation is that by virtue of the mineralization being coarser, that the energy input required to grind it and liberate the sphalerite and will be a bit different. There's also, areas where we strictly see zinc and we don't see a lot of lead. You might I think you would campaign material through the mill and not process Tom and Jason at the same time as boundary. But when you're doing boundary, if there's just zinc, you may also choose to run 2 zinc circuits instead of a lead circuit and a zinc circuit. So there's a lot to think about, but all of these are kind of positive opportunities. But look, we'll know more in the 2021 as we release, as we conduct and then release the results of that metallurgy.
Great. Our next question is from Colin. How much of the known and inferred mineralization sits above the tree line? He's assuming that the major structures run the valleys, but curious to know how the F1 and F2 faults express topographically. If there's smoke in the alpine, some high-res spectral data would be pretty good bang for your buck, especially with expanding land position.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. I first would say we have no inferred resource at boundary zone. I want to make that very clear, and that
I think
that's
we're inferring where we're inferring it as opposed to where it's literally inferred categorically.
Okay. So the mineralization at boundary zone is exclusively below tree line, where it's been discovered to date. So the initial discovery was made by soil sampling and prospecting and trenching right on top of the mineralization. But there's no outcrop down low in the valley, so it makes it very difficult to trace those structures in the immediate area of the deposit. But the structures do project up into the alpine, and they express as topographic lows. They form little gullies in the ridge lines, and you can trace them up there. And what we see up on those ridge lines to the northwest is stratiform barite occurring in the same stratigraphic interval as the massive sulfide. And this was one of the clues that originally pointed us to say, well, we may expect to see that barite plumbed into the fault when you move closer back to boundary zone. And that's exactly what we drilled, this massive sulfide replacement of that barite. In terms of the high-res satellite imagery, yes, that's something that we're looking into right now, is acquiring satellite imagery across the whole of the newly acquired ground. And if we can get something with more than just visible wavelength data, then you're right. That's absolutely going to help us key into some of those areas, especially given that the style of mineralization in the Howitt's Pass style rocks is dark gray sphalerite in a rock that is black, which is very difficult to notice in the field, particularly where it occurs just as sphalerite without any galena or pyrite. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's places where the people have walked over before and not noticed that kind of mineralization because it's so subtle. Even in core, until you wet the core down, it's very difficult to see. So I think that the potential for looking in those areas in the new ground, and yeah, I think you're right that using high-res satellite imagery is really going to help us.
Great. Our next question is from Haig. So what's the exploration priority? Would you develop a resource or keep finding more potential deposits to make sure you don't miss the best one? And another question from Pat that's similar. What's your timing for the next drill program?
Yeah, look, oh, my video is frozen. Sorry, but it sounds like I'm still on audio. So
yep, you're fine.
See my stoic face as I answer here. It's hard to say what the priority is. We kind of got a dual stream priority right now, which is that drill to define an inferred resource at boundary zone, continue doing regional exploration. At some point, you have to kind of put your big boy pants on and drill, get a PFS, commence your permitting, etc. I mean, ultimately, the value in mining is through the extraction, not through the definition. So we have to start that. We're just very wary that in any jurisdiction, and certainly in Yukon, starting your permitting process and particularly getting far into it, and then changing your mind about how you want to do it because you find a new deposit is not going to like make you any friends within the communities or the permitting bodies. So it definitely makes sense to be as thorough as you reasonably can with your exploration before you start getting too deep into permitting. So for those who don't know, Haig Ferris was involved in the discovery of Jason back in the 70s and is named after his son. So Haig, I hope Jason's doing well and good that his namesake is advancing here. Now, in terms of our next drill program, I'm guessing we're not going to start before May. It's really going to depend a lot on the snow cover this year, how quickly that's melting, what we have access to. There's significant during the thaw, the spring thaw. There's significant avalanche risk. So pushing our luck with that when we can just wait a little bit longer doesn't make a lot of sense.
Great, thanks, Brandon. I got a couple questions here about institutional investors. Can you talk a little bit about whether you have institutional investors, who are the major players, and the proportion of shares owned by institutions and management?
Between resource capital funds and other funds and a few other sort of pseudo funds that are more sort of high net worths, I would say total ownership within large hands is probably closer to 30% plus at this point, plus 12% in management, and then you got corporate ownership in both in terms of Tech and Hudbay.
Great, thank you. So if all goes well, how long will it take to reach production in the best case scenario?
It'll be a while. We're still defining what that looks like. Permitting in Yukon's not quick, and we're not really ready to submit our permits yet. As you know, the previous discussion we kind of alluded to there that you want to make sure you're submitting the right thing. It doesn't make sense to rush this and submit a permit for the wrong project. That sets you back more than having just waited and done it properly. The expectation, we hope that we're submitting for permits 2025, I think would be, maybe a little bit before then, 2024 perhaps, submit our permits. And that's really going to be up to how long does it take to get through the permitting system in Yukon at that point in time. And has there been changes to expedite the process, or has the process become more cumbersome and slower? We just don't know until we get there.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we only have about a minute left together. So to round off the Q&A session, maybe we'll end off with the last question from Suresh. What are the major milestones for 2021 that we should be looking forward to?
Well, 2021 and 2022 are going to be pretty milestone heavy. So 2021 itself, I mean, look, there's, there we go. I'm back. Make sure everyone can see my gorgeous beard before we sign off here. So look, there'll be some metallurgy on Boundary Zone in 2021. We'll kick off what is hopefully, this is subject to fundraising, although I'm not terribly concerned about that right now. Quite honestly, we've had a tremendous amount of interest in people investing in us, and it's really about lining up the right partners for this. 2021 should be our biggest ever drill program. There should be a huge amount of results coming. And what that's going to feed into is a new global resource, Tom, Jason, end zone, boundary zone, maybe something else, maybe 11, maybe volcanic, early 2022. And that then feeds a new PEA based on that global resource, which is now a PEA encompassing more than just Tom and Jason. So in terms of the medium term, 18 months, this is about as catalyst rich a schedule as you can hope for. So we're pretty happy. There are always in projects like this, sometimes extended patches where you just have to put your head down and there's not a lot to talk about. there's going to be an awful lot to talk about in the next 2 years.
Well, that's definitely super exciting to look forward to. Well, I want to thank you very much, Brandon and Jack, for taking us through the presentation. And thank you, everyone, for submitting your questions. I know we weren't able to get to everyone's questions today because of the time we have together. But if we weren't able to get to your question, or if you think of a new one afterwards, please stick around. We do have a short survey where you can leave your details for the Fireweed Zinc team to get back to you directly. You can also find more information on their website at www.fireweedzinc.com. And now I'm going to hand it back over to Brandon for the final word.
Yeah, I think I just want to reiterate, you can email myself, Brandon at fireweedzinc.com, or Jack at fireweedzinc.com if you have a more technical question. We're happy to answer questions. I see some people I recognize in the unanswered questions here, so of course, please reach out. The other thing I want to say is that we're available. You know, I think beauty of if there's a thin silver lining on this COVID nightmare, it's that I think we've all come a lot more comfortable with video conferencing and presenting online. So we're happy to give individual presentations. We're happy to talk people through 3D models, pull a screen share, a leapfrog, etc. You know, if you want technical answers, we can dive as deep as you want. We try to be transparent with our data and be as forthcoming as possible. So keep an eye on us. Like I said, I think 2021 is going to be a huge year for us, and I think the future is going to be very bright for the company.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Until next time. Bye now.